Shall we start or, actually I was looking for you. Okay, so welcome back and welcome to the two persons who came last night as well. And any overnight reflections on what we discussed last night? Any thoughts? Anything?
Obviously very diverse overall. There's only millions of people in the entire state. So how do you, or maybe later, how do we're actually, for a small Catholic school, we have a lot of African students and a good number of, we're probably the most diverse school in the state, but it's still very small. How do you make it, bring in diversity, if you will, without it seeming tokenism?
We will go in the afternoon. That's going to be the focus of our conversation, which will connect with the question about introducing the standards. How does cultural diversity, shape the whole implementation of standards that we are receiving from different organizations, whether the USCCB or the LaSallian Brothers or any other institution. So we'll get to those. Thank you for asking that question. Yes.
I'm from Oklahoma, and I could see a growing tension between the church that was and the church that will be. And even as I was stealing some ideas about how do you recruit kids to your school, our base is the church that was. How do we get them to support a school for the church that will be? It just made me think about that tension.
And I will use one word today. Actually, I can say it right now, but it's conversion. We need to change a good number of structures. And the only way for us to go through a process of conversion is to be faced with reality and engage it. But also a few more things. But you're absolutely right. At this point, I'm getting ahead of my talk anyway. But at this point in the United States, most of the traditional structures of formation, whether Catholic school, religious education, youth ministry, college, Catholic colleges are serving that church that was, so mainstream Catholicism. But the question is that there's a whole new force coming from the bottom up, which is not even a minority, numeric minority anymore. So it's present, and we need to ask ourselves, where is it that we stand with our resources and our commitments? Yes.
Later this year, I'm taking a bunch of students down to Tucson, San Miguel School in Tucson to study immigration and migration issues. And I was wondering if today you could maybe touch on the idea of this exodus from Mexico of Latinos looking for a better life, looking for a promised land, how that ties into Latino theology, but yet how it goes against protecting our borders in the post 9/11 world.
It's an amazing question, and in the second hour this morning, we are gonna focus on the Latina experience as a case study. We might not be able to go into that particular conversation, and it's a huge conversation, But again, when we look at that, let's try to touch upon it as much as we can. But thank you for raising that point. Okay, so the challenges of educating in a multicultural church, So just a brief recap for those of you who were not here last night. Yesterday, we began the conversation by reflecting on the major transitions, demographic transitions that we are seeing in the Catholic Church in the United States. In the 1950s, about 90% of all Catholics were Caucasian, white, Euro-American. Today, we are in a much more diverse church. About 43% of all Catholics in this country are Hispanic, about 4%, close to 4%, are Asian Americans, about 4% African Americans, and then there's a large diversity. So Euro-American Catholicism somehow has declined in terms of numbers. But when it comes down to the control of the structures of church, still very, very up there, I'll give one good example is, for instance, to look at the bishops of the United States. There are, if we already know that about half of all Catholics in the country are Hispanic, and it doesn't have to be necessarily a representation, a numeric representation, ratio, no? But there are about 240 active bishops in the United States, Catholic bishops, but only 30 of those 240 are Hispanic, no? Just a handful are African American, and just a handful are Asian American. So in some sense, and I will return to this in the afternoon, in some sense, when the community is changing at the bottom, but remains pretty much the same at the top, then tensions begin to happen. And on the other hand, we need to start asking whether the people at the top, those making the big decisions in terms of finances, for instance, in terms of the curriculum that we use for education, in terms of the commitments that we make as an institution, fully understand what's going on down here at the grassroots level, So, and the question for the people at the grassroots level is how well they are communicating to the different levels of the structures in the church and in our schools what the main needs are. So we find ourselves in the midst of this conundrum. And again, we are focusing primarily on ethnic diversity in this conversation because it seems more manageable, it seems more visible. We can pretty much name the Latinos in a particular region of the country. We can name African Americans, but one interesting discussion, and perhaps in some of the schools like the one you were describing, in Vermont or in Maine, New Hampshire, in other parts of the country, say where ethnicity is not a major key factor, for instance. But we can deal with the culture of secularism, which is one of the most important challenges that we are facing right now. And secularism as such has its own features, its own ways, its own practices, its own attitudes, its own commitments. So how do we name this particular secularism and then without being totally antagonistic, I think that one of the biggest problems that we have sometimes as Christians and as Catholics when we deal with the culture of secularism is that we demonize the secular society. But at some point, and actually, if you ever have a chance to read the work of French-Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, he recently, when was it, about 4 or 5 years ago, he wrote an excellent book. It's huge, it's like 700 pages anyway. But this book is called A Secular Society. And what he does in this book is pretty much saying that in the 21st century, somehow we have entered into a new paradigm, cultural paradigm, Europe has been going through that, but this is a paradigm that has been spreading throughout the world. North America is already beginning to see this. We are seeing it in Latin America. We are seeing it in Asia. So it's the paradigm of the secular age. There are commitments, there are specific metrics or ways of measuring that particular culture. And that's affecting a lot of our own youth. Pew last week, for instance, released this study about religious affiliation in the United States. In 1992, only 4% of the population in the United States identified as nuns, meaning they didn't affiliate with any religious organization. That was 1992, not too long ago. By 2009, there was another survey about religious affiliation, and the number had risen from 4% to about 14%, 15%. 3 years later, another survey is done, and the number has gone up to 20%. Now, there are many factors. We can read statistics, we cannot take them at face value. But we can read a lot of things, when we look at those statistics. And one of them, for instance, is it seems like people, particularly young adults, regardless of their ethnicity, youth and young adults feel more comfortable today to say no to a religious affiliation, easily. And we are seeing this. So we live in a context in which it's easier, and not only easier, but it's actually encouraged by the media, by peer pressure, and sometimes, and oftentimes by personal conviction. So how do we address that emerging culture that eventually will have a major impact in the way we educate Christians in Catholic schools? So let's begin the conversation today. And during this first hour, I want to return to the idea of intercultural competencies. So as I was saying last night, the idea to respond, or the major challenge that we face at this point in our institutions, is how to respond to cultural diversity. And I was saying that it's not just goodwill. Goodwill will not take us that far. We need to be intentional. And in order to do this, we need leadership, whether it's teachers, administrators, whether it's even students, who engage these major issues and then develop a new consciousness as to how we should operate within this particular context. Then we are going to look at briefly, I think we need to ask at this point the question of the Catholic school and the idea of Catholic identity. I think it's a very important question. That was a question that was asked at the end of the 19th century and gave rise to the largest system of Catholic schools, private schools in the whole world. So today, we need to ask that question and see where do we stand vis-a-vis the idea of Catholic identity in terms of the Catholic school. And then the second hour, we are going to explore, we're going to take just one example. We could use the African American experience or the Asian American experience. We could use the secular culture experience. But I think that because of the numbers and how the Latino-Latina presence is impacting not only parish life, but also the whole idea of being a Catholic in the United States, I would like us to use this particular group as a case study. So with that in mind, let's return to our definition of intercultural competence. So this is part of the work that has been done and developed by the Secretariat for Cultural Diversity in the Church in the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And what these people have been doing, actually they worked for several years under the guidance of the first executive director, Jesuit Father Alan Figueroa Deck, in developing this idea. One of the arguments that Father Deck has made for a number of years is that in a multicultural church or in culturally diverse contexts, most groups function as silos, So we see enclaves of Latinos in one place, or we see enclaves of African Americans, enclaves of Euro-Americans throughout the country. Last night I mentioned that we live in a very segregated society, voluntarily segregated. So it is very human, and unless we name that segregation, we will not be able to respond to it. So silos somehow are the model, the prevailing model in which we work, And our Catholic schools are usually located in these silos. I'll give you an example, for instance, it's interesting to see that many of the Catholic schools that have closed over the last 12 years have closed primarily in urban settings, inner city. And who are the students who go to these schools? Usually students of color, But the schools that are more vibrant and the ones that are surviving are usually in the suburbs. So one of the questions that we need to ask is it possible for the schools in the suburbs to engage in a conversation that bring diversity into its structures and its ways of being, or should it be something that it's only the purview of Catholic schools in urban settings? And if that's the case, what about when these schools don't exist anymore? So that's an important question. No? So Alan Dick says that it is important, and actually the bishops, that's what a lot of theologians, Robert Schreider and some others are also saying this, that it is important for us to develop cultural competencies. That means that we need to know how to engage, how to begin this conversation. And they define it as the capacity to communicate, relate, and work across cultural boundaries. It involves developing the capacity in 3 areas: knowledge, skills, and attitudes. In other words, cultural competencies is about an active commitment to the reality within which we are inserted. So it calls for action. But what kind of action? How is this action shaped? Let's take each one of these 3 elements: knowledge, skills, and attitudes. What does knowledge involve? Knowledge involves to know that there is more than one perspective on everything. And a lot of this sounds commonsensical, to be honest with you. But the problem is, actually, Jesuit philosopher, theologian Bernard Lonergan used to say that common sense is the first level of consciousness that every human being has, But that's the level of consciousness where most of us actually fail. So we're supposed to be experts on common sense, but we just don't live it. We just don't do it, no? So knowledge of the fact that there are many perspectives around the world and in our surroundings. Spanish philosopher Xavier Zubiri, if you have ever had a chance to engage in his work, he used to say, he had this theory called perspectivism. And what Zubiri said was this: all of us are always standing in front of a specific horizon, with a position in front of a horizon. Lonergan does a little bit of this as well. So the thing is that when I stand right here and I look in front, I look at my horizon, I can only see what's in front of me, but I'm missing a lot of what's behind me or to my side. If I turn around and if I stand on this reality, then I see all this reality, but I'm missing all this. Commonsensical, but very important. Our Western societies, then, unfortunately have failed to take into consideration the fact that it is necessary for all of us to pull together the different perspectives that we have so we can understand reality as a whole. So what's happening is that once I stand in a particular place, a particular socio-historical location, socio-economic location, and I grow roots in that particular context, then the chances are that I will settle with that particular view. Now, let's add to this the issue of power. So if you are standing from this particular perspective, and then you have the power to make decisions, then you are going to say, most of your decisions are going to be based on what you see, what you experience. And the chances are that your decisions will affect not only that group that you see, but every community. Let's do this example here. I could certainly choose this particular block of my perspective and say, from now on, I'm going to focus on the experience of this particular group for my presentation. But then I'm missing the perspective of a large number of people here, a large number of people here. So cultural competence requires that we make the intentional effort to know the different realities and perspectives that shape our own context. And that requires dialogue. That requires intentionality. Last night we talked about US Latino-Latina theology, African American theology. The only way for us to learn about it is to intentionally sit down and read about it or listen from someone who can help us, who can guide us through it. No? But we live in a context in which, if we live in our silos, it is difficult, and we will not listen to these other perspectives. So we can easily adopt a colonizing attitude in which we say, my perspective is the one that rules. My perspective is the one that actually commands everything that we do in our school or in our different institutions. 2, knowledge of different interpretations of the same cultural reality. And here is an important aspect. Every human being is an interpreter of reality. In other words, we all participate in the hermeneutical praxis of life. Every human being has the capacity to make meaning, transform meaning, and reinterpret meaning. Nevertheless, in every society and in every institution, there exist what we would call the official interpreters of reality. No? Let's take an example. Scriptures. So the Constitution Dei Verbum at the Second Vatican Council tells us that the official interpreter of the Scriptures is the magisterium. So we already have an official interpreter. I wonder who are the official interpreters of the Lassallean vision, for instance. You know, could be Brother Frederick, you know, or it could be someone else. So, who are the official interpreters? There is nothing wrong with having official interpreters in every community. For instance, in the United States, in our country, we have the official interpreters of the Constitution. You know, usually it's the Supreme Court. No, so we have those official interpreters. However, the problem is when the official interpreters of reality close themselves up to other potential interpretations of that same reality. And when that happens, ooh, what is that? I decline. Good. I just made an interpretation here. So, when one group determines that there is only one way of interpreting X or Y reality, X or Y vision, immediately we not only we close ourselves up to other potential interpretations, but we deny the right that every group, every person has to participate in the hermeneutical praxis of reality. And that's an interesting point. That is an interesting point because, say, we're living in a multicultural context, you know. Perhaps New Hampshire is not going to be our best example right now, but let's go all the way to California. No, let's go to Los Angeles. Or let's do Philadelphia, for instance, or New York, or Detroit, or some other places where diversity is more visible, you know, to us. So one of the questions that we need to ask when making decisions about diversity and about the next steps for our schools and our vision, our programs, our curriculum is, who is at the table engaging in conversation about the future of the vision or the future of our decisions? So how we honor the different voices of the community that we hope to address. No? Yesterday, I mentioned that the school, the Catholic school, Catholic college, has a social responsibility to the context within which it is inserted. But how effective will be the Catholic school in that context if it does not engage in dialogue with the community that surrounds it? Or, for instance, and we will see this this afternoon, how do we work with Latino students or African American students or immigrant students without engaging in conversation with their families, for instance. No? So the moment we start separating the different interpretations and we don't allow them to inform our decisions, therefore our decisions will be very, very limited. Thirdly, knowledge involves the knowledge of general dynamics of intercultural communication. Yes, brother.
Just that section that you were just covering. What of people who would say that that's the slippery slope to subjective reality rather than objective reality? Which is the movement, right?
Absolutely.
Each person has the right to interpret.
To be honest with you, the whole idea of objective reality is more of a construct. You know, I mean, every moment you have a human person engaging in a process of interpretation, you have a subjective dimension there. So, and again, I go back to what I was saying yesterday. That idea of being neutral or being fully objective, I have problems with it. I think it's problematic. It's problematic, you know. That doesn't mean that we're gonna fall into an insane relativism. You know, that does not mean that. It means that we, instead of claiming objectivity or full neutrality, which is almost impossible, you know, if I am a male, I will always make decisions as a male. If I am a woman, I will make decisions as a woman. If I am an immigrant, I make decisions and I see reality as an immigrant. You know, it always happens. That's who I am. Whole issue of identity when we were talking about yesterday. So, but the question is, instead of negating the subjectivity that informs our decisions and our discernment, what about if we begin by affirming that subjectivity and then come together, and develop criteria that actually enrich everyone without having to give up essential values? And I think that perhaps that's a better way to go. But you're right, you know, and that's the challenge. The whole idea of objectivity, I think, is very complicated. It's very complex.
But if I'm a magisterium,
yes,
I'm going to hold to an objective reality.
But that's power. Power, absolutely. Well, Michel Foucault, you know, that's pretty much what he said, you know. All you need to do is exert your power no matter what, you know. And therefore, you know, if you find ways to exert power, no, regardless, even if you know that it is not true, but as long as it gives you power, then everything goes, you know. So it's the justification of power for the sake of power. The knowledge of general dynamics of intercultural communication. Well, we live in a context, we live in a multicultural context in which, even though we claim that we understand each other, there are elements of communication that are explicit, and there are implicit elements of communication. And in a multicultural world, that is important. The way, we can be speaking exactly the same language, We can understand each other, but body language, the way we dress, the way we eat, the way we cook, the way we teach, those are elements that are always shaping who we are. They are underneath. And in the process of intercultural communication, it's not enough to learn the language of the other. For instance, in the United States, one of the biggest challenges that the Catholic Church is facing is the whole idea of Latinos wanting to hold on to Spanish. And then you have these groups everywhere saying, only English. We are in America, only English. So, fine. Most Latinos, as a matter of fact, in the United States are English speaking, so that's not even a problem. It's not a major issue, you know? So, but the problem is that it's not just about learning English or learning Spanish. It's about learning the culture, those subsets of culture that inform who we are. What are the beliefs? What does it mean to be an American, for instance? You know? What does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be Catholic? What does it mean to be a LaSallian educator? Those elements of communication or those values are not completely visible, They somehow lay underneath what we see. No? It's easy to say African Americans are A, B, and C. No, we can describe them in this way. It's easy to say all women are A, B, and C based on what we do and on what we see. But what about those elements that are unique to each one of us, and when we start engaging with each other, we do not take into consideration? Let me illustrate this in a much better way. Look at this. This is one image that is constantly used when we speak about culture. No? Most of the time, when we say, okay, let's talk about Asian Americans, no? Or let's talk about Protestantism in a class, or Buddhism in a class. So regardless of the element of culture that we decide to study, most of the time we just focus on what we see, on the externals of reality, But how many times do we take or do we make the effort to try to see what is underneath? No, what is underneath? No, one exercise that I do with my students, at Boston College, I teach a course called Ministry and Culture, and one of the exercises that we do is at the beginning of the class, I ask my students, let's describe everything you know about Latinos, And so they give me everything, they everything know, Jennifer Lopez and, tacos and Our Lady of Guadalupe and immigrants and so forth, And then we make a long list of things that we have perceived, externally usually. So we know, this is what we know about Latinos. And then we do the same thing with other groups. We do it with Euro-Americans, we do it with African Americans, we do it with Asian Americans. So we have all these external dimensions that we claim that identify a particular culture. Then throughout the semester, what we do is we start going deeper into each of the cultures. And we start analyzing each of the cultures historically. Why are there so many Mexicans in the United States? I mean, we constantly hear, go back to Mexico, go back to your country. That's what we're always saying. There is always a critique, there is a constant critique that why are there so many African Americans who are poor? And we think that, a lot of people want to say that this is an option. But then when you start going deeper into the culture and into the structures of society, political decisions, socio-political location, then we start delving into the whole idea, into a large unknown world that after we emerge from studying, then we have a whole different perspective. So somehow, multicultural or intercultural competencies requires that we go beyond the tip of the iceberg. Intercultural competency requires that we intentionally decide to know more than what we can see, more than what we have observed externally. And the last point that I wanted to highlight in terms of knowledge is this: knowledge of more than one's first language. Perhaps in your schools, You might not need to learn different languages to engage the population with whom you work, because everybody, classes are done in English, and it's expected that everybody will do it in English. However, school children are not isolated. Children do not come to our schools as tabula rasa, for instance. No? Children do not come to our schools isolated from social circles that shape their lives. And in the field of multicultural studies, that's an important point that has been made all the way from the 1950s. This has been discussed. So when you have the Latino student in the classroom and you begin to develop any particular subject, whether in religion or history or civics or any other subject at school, then if one ignores those networks that give life and meaning to the student, literally what we are doing is cutting off a big part of who our students are. And this doesn't apply only to Latinos. It applies to every student. Now, the issue of language is important because in many cases, particularly those schools where there is a large immigrant Latino population or large Asian immigrant population, the parents are not fluent in English. So it is important, for instance, for the school to have someone in the school community who's able to serve as a liaison to work with those parents, to work with those families. When the school is inserted in a multicultural neighborhood, it is important for the school to be able to understand that culture or those cultures in those different languages. And oftentimes, this is important, learning another language. In 1972, there was a major gathering of Latino leaders, Catholic leaders in the United States, called the First Encuentro. And in this first encounter, what these Latinos said, we need to know every priest in the United States should learn Spanish. No, that was 1972. So why? Well, because the numbers are growing and the presence, at least in the Southwest. And there was large opposition on the part of the institutional church to that idea, And maybe it was too much that everybody needed to learn Spanish back then because the numbers were not there. But what's interesting is that according to the Directory of Priestly Formation that we have today, as a matter of fact, all priests, all seminarians are encouraged to learn a second language, preferably Spanish, because that's the reality. Now, I do not know that much about the specific context of your own school, but the question that I think that I invite you to wrestle with is, what are the languages that are spoken around your community? The children coming to your, the young people coming to your community, what languages are spoken at home? What are the languages that are spoken in your neighborhood? When you do, for instance, those of you working in campus ministry, you are constantly running social projects, social initiatives, of service initiatives, What's the language that's being used in this? How do we honor the language and the symbols of the people we claim to serve? That's an important question that we need to ask. Second, intercultural competences require that we develop skills. Skills, the ability to empathize, the ability to relate to the other in his or her own situation. So how do we work with a child whose parents are immigrants, for instance? How do we work with people who are speaking English as a second language? How do we work with families of divorced parents, children who come from divorced parents? So ability to empathize. And this, again, requires practice, but it requires intentionality. Ability to tolerate ambiguity. Friends, working in a multicultural context is not a rosy situation, you know. It's not easy. Of course it's not, you know, because differences challenge us. Working in a culturally diverse context, speaking with someone who can barely understand what we say, or sometimes trying to get ourselves across. I don't know how many of you here speak a second language, you know, but if you have tried to communicate with someone in your second language and you have a basic command of the language, sometimes it's difficult to get your ideas across. And I can tell you from experience, you know, I had to learn English as an adult. And it was like being born again. It was like being born again. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy, and still it's not easy. So, but intercultural competence requires that we tolerate this ambiguity and the challenges that ambiguity brings to us, you know. So having to deal with race issues, having to deal with different perspectives about life. In parish life, for instance, you know, and this is an amazing experience. In parish life, or actually some of you who are doing campus ministry may actually understand this as well, but in parish life, if you want to see action and you want to see an interesting dynamic, try to pull together a multicultural service, for instance, you know, a multilingual service. And then, you know, bring leaders from different ethnic communities or language communities. And then we're constantly challenged, you know, what goes in one language, what goes on another. Why do you do things like that? No? Why don't you do them this way? Why do we do them this way? No? So, finally, ability to adapt communication and behavior. That is required as part of the skills. How do we adapt communication and behavior? The way we speak. I go back to the way we dress, the way we interact with people. I gave you the example, for instance, last night about the Mexican priest who comes, and the first thing he's told is, we don't avoid physical contact, you know. And that's what intercultural competence is about. So sometimes you need to avoid contact, sometimes physical contact is permitted, depending on the particular context. One of the challenges that we have in ministry, for instance, is with priests coming from Africa, coming from Latin America, who are not used to the model of lay ecclesial ministry. That's a huge challenge, you know, huge challenge, because in most of Africa or Latin America, the laity do not play the role that they do here in the context in ecclesiastical circles. So sometimes it's hard for not only clergy, but also for other lay leaders coming from these countries to understand the dynamics of having a woman being the pastoral associate or the parish life coordinator overseeing the whole community, no? So, or a woman teaching theology. Some African leaders have difficulties with these issues. But that's what the skills require that we begin to change behaviors and adapt to the new realities. So, as I was saying last night, intercultural competency is not only for whites to understand blacks, Hispanics, Asians. It is everyone to understand each other. Because at the end of the day, we build the same communities. That's what we're doing. We're training people to build the same communities. We are educating people to build the same community. And the third prone in this case, in this aspect of building multicultural competencies, intercultural competencies, is attitudes. Attitudes includes openness to others and other cultures. No? Openness to others and to other cultures. I think that we have grown in this area. We have grown as a church, as a society. We have grown a lot in those areas. But there's still a lot to do. There's still a lot to do. You know, there are parts of the country where intolerance is still very strong. if there is something, theologian, African-American theologian, Brian Massingale, says that in the United States, still we have not overcome the greatest sin, which is racism. We haven't. We haven't. Still bugs us down, you know. Still, it's still there. Might not be totally explicit. Sometimes it's very explicit. So we need to open ourselves to other cultures, but we cannot embrace the National Geographic, you know, model of engaging culture. You know, just learning about Latinos in a magazine, you know, or when we want to do something Latino, we just throw a big sombrero, you know, just put it on someone. But again, that's what happens, you know. So we need to open ourselves to other cultures, and being open to other culture, to the other and to other cultures requires that we go deeper into this iceberg, cultural iceberg that I was describing. Wanting to learn and engage other cultures. So one thing is to be open to those cultures, realizing that for some of us, it's not a choice. You know, if you live in Philadelphia, friends, it is not a choice. If you live in New York, it is not a choice. If you live in Boston, it's not a choice. You live almost in most of the major cities, it is not a choice. So the other, the culturally different other, is with us, whether we like it or not. And they are here to stay. They are here to stay. The other is here to stay. So it's not only being open to that presence, which in itself requires some conversion, but it's also wanting to learn and engage others. And actually, I think that this is something that we as educators, through our ministry, through our service in the classroom, or in the experiences of religious education and worship that we provide, this is something that we can instill in our own students. Because what I'm saying here is not just for us. As a matter of fact, what I'm saying here, this is something that I would love to every Catholic, every educator, as a matter of fact, to bring with themselves and make part of their own methodologies, their own commitments, their own curricular commitments. This is something that it's for us, but also for our students. Because actually one of the key elements of education is that we are building, we are forming people to build society. We are forming citizens. And these are important skills that we can pass on to them. Understanding intercultural interaction as a way of life, not a problem to be solved. No? In the 1970s and 80s, there were some interesting documents that refer to Latinos, sometimes African Americans, as the Latino problem. You know? So what is the church going to do with the Latino problem? Or the Latino issue? Well, if we can step backwards and look, and instead of looking at the Latino presence or multiculturalism as a problem, but rather as a way of life, that's what reality is, then we might somehow open new windows and doors to a different kind of conversation. Secularism, for instance. That's an important aspect, you know. Now at the Synod of the New Evangelization, everybody's talking about secularism, you know, secularism. But a lot of ways in which secularism is being presented is in a demonized way, you know, bad secularism. You know, there's nothing good in secularism. Well, what about if we take a step back and see what is going on, what's happening in the secular world, you know? What are the elements of value that exist there? Of course, the secular society challenges religious institutions. Sometimes it goes against religious institutions. It's fine to understand that. But the question is it possible to engage with people who have embraced this particular culture in conversation? Can we build society? Can we build a society in a context where secularism is present? Should the church retrieve, entrench, in a little corner, and then say, secularism, bad, 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 and here we are, the chosen ones, the holy ones, the ones who have the only truth. Charles Taylor, as I was saying, calls us, invites Christians, as a matter of fact, not only Christians, invites all women and men of faith to seriously begin a conversation with the secular structures of society. Secularism is here to stay and it's not going to go away. In Europe, in the 21st century, there was this French journalist who wrote a book, I forgot the name, but he said, Europe is Catholicism, Catholicism is Europe, A few decades later, only a handful of the small percentage of the population in Europe identifies as Catholic. So it's not that we need to demonize this, or secularism is one example, but we need to be careful not to embrace demonizing or antagonistic attitudes without being critical. Of course, we need to be critical of each other. Culture is not always perfect, and we need to critique each other. And mindfulness, just know that we are there. We need to be mindful that the other is present. How do we get there? Well, 3 points. One, intentionality. And I think you have already heard me say this word a number of times. We must make an express commitment to engage diversity in the context of the church. It has to be intentional. It has to be intentional. We must want to engage cultural diversity not in the abstract, not as something that is out there that doesn't touch me, but as it is here and now. We must respond to the challenges of cultural diversity, and at the same time, we are called to see its possibilities. Now, it's going to be different in each case, Actually, let me try to begin to enter into a potential answer, to the question, what's your name again? Brian, that Brian asked at the beginning. I think that question, the question of, what about if my context is not too diverse as some other contexts, or at least ethnically, culturally diverse? I think that one of the first entries into that reality is that even though we do not face or see diversity in a very explicit way, what we know is that our students eventually will be going out into a larger reality beyond our schools. And even though we don't have, if we don't have an explicit relationship with people from other cultures or people who are challenging our own status quo, what we can do is provide them with the skills and the knowledge, and help them to widen their vision and know that reality is diverse. So instead of waiting for our schools to change, or our contexts to change, what about if we provide them with the skills and the appropriate knowledge to begin to have these conversations? African American educators, as a matter of fact, have some African American educators have developed a curriculum that is called, actually they call it anti-bias curriculum, and you find this it's in the literature. And anti-bias curriculum, as a matter of fact, is pretty much a set of lessons and skills that are given to small children when they come into school. It's like a vaccine, as a matter of fact, But it's important. It's very important. There was a research study a number of years ago at Harvard University, in which they presented images of white and black people in different situations, to little kids, little children, and the only thing they had to do, once they look at a picture, was say good or bad. That's all they had to do. Good, bad, good, bad. So there were white people, portrayed doing good things and bad things. And there were black people doing good things and bad things. Little kids, 4 years old, through this exercise, this experiment. And what happened, that in most cases, a black person appeared on the image, the child would say bad, 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 bad. So when their parents learned about the results of the study, they were shocked. Yeah? Oh my gosh, we are not racist. We're not racist. But it's not about the parents oftentimes. It's not about the parents. It's about the media. It's about the environment in which these children are. So what these educators are doing is that we need to begin at an early age to start talking. No, we need to start at an early age to talk about the effects of racism, to identify situations when there is racism. And actually, that could apply to every bias. Bias against women, bias against people who are poor, bias against people who are gay, bias against any kind of diversity that we see in society. So it goes here again. How do we get there? We need to start these conversations in the classroom. We need to start these conversations in the in-service opportunities that our schools have. We need to start these conversations with the administrators of our schools. It has to happen. It has to be intentional. As a matter of fact, what you're doing here is ahead of the game. This is part of the conversation. We need to have it. But you're just a handful of educators. So the question is, how do we bring this to other educators, administrators, and then through them, how do we bring it through the rest of the curriculum and through our students? Second, yes.
Affirm what you said in the prior section that this has to be a prime time curriculum. I've been dealing for the past 3 years with the diversity curriculum, school-wide diversity, and working with a group of students. We did broad-based focus groups. They are calling, and we don't have great diversity, we have 20% of African Americans. All of the students, though, are calling for this because their experience is different than mine. Their experience through internet, another reality, is that they see a reality that I only came to see by my direct experience. So they were already asking questions about what it means to be different, and whether it's gay, whatever, because the differences are right in front of them. So I agree 100%. They're crying for teachers to address it in the classroom. Not like a discussion group afterwards. They want to hear how it fits into the way that they're learning.
Absolutely.
It's their fault.
Yep.
Across the board.
Absolutely. And again, we all need to develop these skills, these social skills or citizenship skills. And the question is that if schools don't provide them, what happens is that we end up perpetuating the status quo of whatever institution, And we could have, I can give you examples of, for instance, sectors in the United States, sections in the United States where Latinos have lived in enclaves, and then they just don't break out of the enclaves, and it's the only Latino enclave, or the only white suburb, or the only white, or the only black neighborhood. There are tons of those, and unless we expose these children, these young people to this diversity, we won't get out of that. We won't change things. Formation. So, again, to speak the obvious, we need to begin to engage in content. We need to find the content that is going to help us. Methodology. How do we find methodologies that lead us into an openness to the other, to the cultural other? Structures within the school and continuous assessment. I think that's an important aspect, And I'm not too familiar with, at least in the context of Catholic schools, how Catholic schools have developed criteria for assessment regarding diversity. It would be interesting as you implement certain guidelines and curricular guidelines to see, are there any criteria that allows you to somehow measure how much students are learning about, for instance, in theology, how much are they learning about the religious experience of non-mainstream Catholics? There should be some kind of assessment there, and should be periodic as well, periodic as well. So I think that, for instance, in a Catholic school, that's one of my eternal battles, in my university. One of my arguments is that anybody at this point in the United States going through a program of formation for ministry should have a solid understanding of the culturally diverse reality of the church. Whether you are going to teach theology, you are going to be a priest, you are going to do campus ministry, everybody must have that. Not everybody's on board, believe me. Not everybody's on board, because we are hoping for an ideal assimilation, that eventually we're going to become one. Sure, in eternity, but in the meantime, we have to start working here, we really need to start working here. And this is the word that I mentioned earlier, conversion. This is not going to happen overnight. This is a lifetime process. But I think, friends, that perhaps this concept makes more sense for us as Catholics, and as women and men who bring our faith into what we do as educators and ministers. We might need to change things and how things are done. That's what diversity actually does to us. When we are exposed to different values, we change. We change. At first, it might be a negative reaction, perhaps. At first, it might be a burden to some of us. But regardless of what the reaction that we have, being exposed to diversity and to the ideas of a diverse church and a diverse reality calls for some change. This change, this conversion often implies listening to other voices and letting go of certain models. So in your schools, I wonder how many, for instance, African American teachers are there. How many Latino teachers are there? How many women are teaching? How many Asian Americans are teaching? How do we tolerate? How do we tolerate diversity? Are there any immigrant teachers working in your schools? So those are the questions that we need to start asking, because cultural diversity, or these skills, if there is going to be a conversion, we need sometimes to let go. And of course, everybody wants to be part of the status quo, isn't it? Everybody wants to call the shots. Everybody wants to be in power. But without being attentive to the voices of the people who are shaping the reality outside of our schools, our schools will not actually open the doors to begin the conversations within. So that's an important aspect. Okay, why don't we stop right here? But before we do that, reactions, thoughts, comments? Alan?
Spoke about the status quo, and like Brian from Manchester, Pittsburgh has been relatively insulated from demographic diversity, and so for conversion to happen, if people are very happy with the status quo, how do you affect that type of change?
Challenge them. Because by now you know more than they do. So that's the thing, you see? So, I mean, as an educator, you're a campus minister, or as a campus minister, you know, you have had the training and you've been exposed to conversations like this one, you know? So the only way to do this is by challenging them. And you're right, schools or certain parts of society can be very isolated. That's one of the biggest challenges, for instance, that we're facing in Catholic seminaries in the United States. You bring a group of men, you know, throw them into enclose them for 4 or 5 years in a place, you know, and then you just give them some training, a lot of Thomas Aquinas, a lot of scriptures, canon law, you know, but you never talk to them about Latinos, Latinas, or African Americans, or women, you know, or the challenges that are out there. And then you throw them back, you know, into society. The number, you know, it's shocking. For a lot of them, it's shocking, and many leave the priesthood, as a matter of fact. So now that we know this, we need to challenge them. We have a responsibility. Last night, I was talking about that when we are faced with cultural diversity, we must be responsive and responsible. There is a responsiveness. We cannot remain hands down in front of cultural diversity, because that's what's happening. That's the world. But on the other hand, it's an ethical responsibility. We have the responsibility of training, educating our students to be aware of what's going on. In the Boston area, Boston is very diverse per se. But then you start moving westwards, you know, and then, so diversity, except in Worcester and Springfield, you know, it's not the biggest challenge or the biggest issue. However, it's interesting to see that I have met young women and men who tell me that they never met a black person or a Latino person till they went to college. And to me, to be honest with you, it's shocking that in the 21st century, we still live like that, you know. It still live like that, you know. But again, people are beginning to see diversity through the media, through their friends. They are more open to this idea. So how do we use what we already have to challenge them?
We also have to make the walls of the school permeable.
Yes.
We have to let people in. I'm not just talking students in, but there are things like speakers who can come in.
Absolutely.
And we have to let kids out.
Yes.
Because every city has opportunities for diversity of people.
Absolutely.
Who could bring the challenge.
Those of you who
we
are
ourselves can't do.
Those of you who are doing campus ministry, I think that you have the best opportunities to do this. But it cannot only going out there to see diversity for a couple of days and then return. That's one of the biggest critiques of these field trips or those immersion experiences. You know, that you have. We are so comfortable in our own context. And then we bring our kids to El Salvador or to Mexico or to San Antonio. We expose them to the poor reality, you know, people are struggling, and then they come back and life goes on as if nothing had happened, you know. What can we do to make this a permanent concern? One more point. Who was the other person? Go ahead and then.
I know we can't deal with it all here, but on that question of what's the composition of our faculty and staff. So Alan certainly can give you a lot of statistics, and perhaps that's something I probably failed to do. Should have given you our regional and district statistics so you have that in your mind. But let's just put on the table, the vast majority of our educational ministries, with some exceptions, do not have diversity on faculty and staff. It just isn't, right? Even in those ministries that are serving a diverse population, their faculty and staff are not necessarily diverse. All right, so that's the general rate. Okay. And I'm assuming, right, there are lots of factors that feed into why that might be the case. But given where you walk, and particularly your experience, Hoffman, in terms of the Latino community, is there also, though, something on the other side? That is, some can argue that Catholic schools generally are not doing enough to recruit, all right? But is there something on the other side in terms of, and I know it's the case for African Americans that I hear, about, one, salaries, all right, and to the venue itself, right? That if you don't see at least a plurality of persons who look like you, who talk like you, quote unquote, that's not going to bring you into that community. And I know that's an issue for students as well, right? Those of our schools that are struggling to become more diverse in terms of students of color, if students don't see a bevy of students who look like them, it becomes a difficult dynamic. So can you just speak to that just briefly? I know we want to.
I can say yes to all you said. Yes, yes. As a matter of fact, we're going to get into the Latino case study, and I'll give you some statistics about it. But one of the issues has to do with the levels of education as well among Latinos. The pool of potential teachers and administrators for Catholic schools is very, very, very small. It's very small. So that's one of the challenges. But yes, what you described, in terms of African American students in some of our schools, happens at the level of theological formation in seminaries. About 50% of Latinos who begin a doctoral program in theology drop out. And not because they cannot do the work, simply because of lack of mentoring. They don't see other Latinos helping them. Happens to African Americans. Happens to women, as a matter of fact. That's a big issue. So if faculties do not bring more women as administrators and as professors, teachers, at every level of education, women will continue to lag behind, in this process. So, yes, but let's wait until we engage the statistics with Latinos, but what you said applies. Last point.
Really quick, I like what you said about the attitudes that shape interculture competency, about the secular diversity and how we sometimes demonize secularism. Because I know in ministry-wise, I struggle with bringing students who do kind of identify themselves as secular, like Catholic seculars, on retreat, and how do you engage them on retreat, or even mass, liturgy, how do you engage them in opportunities and programs that can deepen their faith while still not demonizing them and kind of putting, like you were saying, putting ourselves in this corner of we're holier than you, we put on the holy hat. So I struggle with how do you bring programs and engage students who see themselves as diverse in terms of being secular.
If only we read the context in which the fathers of the church, for instance, did ministry. Most people did not believe in what they had, So you had these people engaging them in conversations through philosophy, through the arts, great conversations. We should return to some of that, instead of saying or claiming that we cannot have a conversation, with these more secular structures of society. Very good. So I think that I know that I'm over the time, but let's take a how long break?